The night was supposed to be nothing more than a quiet homecoming, a soldier returning after 2 long years away. But when Silas Miller stepped into the shadowed hallway of his Mapleford house, his German shepherd, Ranger, stiffened, ears sharp. Then came the sound that froze Silas where he stood, a scream, high and desperate, tearing through the walls. He burst into the room and his heart shattered. Two little girls in torn pink dresses, their cheeks streaked with tears, huddled in the corner. Standing over them was the stepmother he thought he could trust. In that moment, Silas realized the war was not over. It had only just come home. The echo of the scream still clung to the walls as Silas Miller charged up the narrow staircase, his boots striking the wood like distant thunder. 2 years of combat drills and tactical operations had not prepared him for this sound. The desperate wail of children, high-pitched, raw, filled not with the chaos of battle but with the terror of innocence. At his heels bounded Ranger, his German shepherd, the dog's thick coat darkened by the rain still dripping from their long walk through the night streets of Mapleford City. Ranger's ears were pricked, hackles rising, a low growl already rumbling from his chest. Silas had expected home to feel like a sanctuary. Instead, as he burst through the doorway, it felt like enemy territory. The air was thick with lavender and synthetic lemon, scents that made the place feel staged, as if scrubbed clean of real life. The photographs that once lined the hallway, the pictures of Clara and Lily smeared with jam on their cheeks, their gap-toothed smiles beaming at the camera, were gone, replaced with framed prints of flowers and landscapes, neutral and soulless. His hand, still calloused from years of service, skimmed the wall as he ascended, and for a flicker of a second, he thought of his late wife's touch, the one person who had once made this house pulse with warmth. When Silas reached the landing, Ranger lunged first, pressing his nose to the bottom of the closed door where the cries had erupted. Another scream pierced the air, sharper, more desperate. "Daddy!" The voice cracked in a way that made Silas's heart clench. He grabbed the doorknob, locked. With the force of a man who had broken down doors in war zones, he stepped back and kicked. The door swung open violently, slamming against the wall. Inside, under the dim glow of a bedside lamp, two little girls were huddled in the corner. Clara and Lily Miller, 6 years old, identical yet always carrying subtle differences only a father could see. Clara's hair, a wild tangle of chestnut curls, stuck to her tear-streaked face, while Lily's straighter strands clung to her temples with sweat. Both wore matching pink dresses, torn at the hem, dirt smudged across the fabric as though they had been shoved to the ground. Their bare feet pressed into the cold wooden floor, trembling. A red mark spread across Clara's cheek, angry and fresh. And standing between them and the bed was Veronica Hale. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe knot at the back of her head, her lips painted the deep red of wine that stained instead of softened. She was younger than Silas by nearly a decade, once the woman who had seemed like a promise of a second chance when grief had hollowed him. But in that moment, her face looked sharp, her eyes flashing not surprise but irritation, as though she had been caught in the middle of a chore interrupted. Her hand still clutched a pillow, its corners wrinkled from a grip too tight to be casual. For a suspended heartbeat, all froze. The children pressed back against the wall, Veronica's hand froze in mid-motion, Silas standing in the doorway with his chest heaving, Ranger's growl reverberating like an approaching storm. Then the silence cracked. Ranger stepped forward, lips curled, teeth bared in a primal warning that needed no translation. He positioned himself between the twins and Veronica, his massive frame a living barricade. "What the hell is going on here?" Silas's voice was hoarse, not from shouting, but from the weight of what he saw. Veronica blinked, then forced a smile that did not touch her eyes. They were running around, slipped, screamed. Overdramatic as always. I was just calming them down. "Calming them down?" Silas repeated, his gaze narrowing. His training had taught him to read lies in enemy combatants. The twitch of an eye, the pause before speech. And Veronica's performance faltered under scrutiny. He crouched, ignoring her explanation, and reached toward Clara. The girl flinched at first, shoulders tightening, but then allowed his rough hand to graze her cheek. The red mark burned beneath his fingers. He shifted to Lily, checking her arms. There were faint bruises along her wrist, the kind that didn't come from a tumble on a bedroom floor. His jaw tightened. Veronica's voice rose, sharper. "You're tired, Silas. You don't know what you're seeing. They're clumsy, always falling over themselves. But the house betrayed her. It was too clean, too sterile. No scattered toys, no crayons on the coffee table, no stuffed animals lying abandoned in the hallway. Instead, every corner gleamed, arranged like a display, as if someone had erased all traces of childhood. Silas felt his stomach turn. He lifted both girls into his arms. Clara buried her face against his shoulder, shivering. Lily's tiny hands clutched the fabric of his jacket with desperate strength. Ranger pressed close, his nose brushing against the children, his body tense but protective. Silas descended the stairs without a word, his boots heavy, the wooden steps creaking with each step. Veronica followed, her tone switching from defensive to sweet, her words dripping false concern. "You're overreacting, Silas. They'll make you think things that aren't true. You know how children exaggerate." He ignored her. At the bottom of the stairs, he set the girls gently onto the couch, wrapping them in the wool throw blanket that once belonged to their mother. He knelt so his face was level with theirs. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice steadier than he felt. "No one touches you." Not again, Clara's lips trembled. She whispered something so soft he had to lean in to hear. "She said if we told, you'd leave again, and never come back." The words sliced deeper than any battlefield wound. Silas swallowed hard, his eyes burning. "No, I'm here. I'm not leaving you again. I promise." He reached for Lily's hand, squeezing gently until she finally squeezed back, faint but real. Behind him, Veronica crossed her arms, leaning against the wall with a look of calculated indifference. Her presence was poison, but for the first time Silas saw her not as a misguided partner, but as the enemy within his own walls. Outside, Mapleford City was still soaked in the storm, rain tapping against the windows like a metronome of unease. The street lamps cast pale halos across the suburban lawns, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle mourned. But inside, a battle line had been drawn. Ranger curled at the base of the couch, eyes never leaving Veronica. His breathing was steady, his loyalty unyielding. In his silent watch, Silas found a strange comfort, the kind that reminded him not all comrades carried rifles. Some carried only the weight of devotion, fierce and unbreakable. Silas leaned back, his muscles aching, the fatigue of 2 years of service catching up to him all at once. Yet he knew sleep would not come. Not tonight, not until he uncovered every truth buried in this house. The cry that had begun this night had not been just a scream of fear. It was a call to arms, a plea for protection. And Silas, soldier or not, had answered. The house had grown quieter after the storm of screams, but the silence was brittle, like glass waiting to shatter at the lightest touch. Silas settled on the worn couch, with Clara and Lily curled against him, both girls wrapped in the woolen throw that still carried faint traces of their late mother's perfume. He adjusted the fabric around their shoulders, one hand gently brushing their hair back, the other resting protectively across their small frames. Ranger lay stretched across the floor, his broad chest rising and falling slowly, yet his amber eyes never strayed from Veronica, who lingered in the doorway, pretending indifference. As the minutes ticked past midnight, Silas whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but knew he had to. "I'm here. I'm not leaving again," he said softly, his voice steady as stone, though his insides trembled. Clara's lips quivered, her little fingers clutching at his sleeve. "She said, if we told you, you'd go away forever," she murmured. The words pierced him deeper than shrapnel ever could. Lily, quieter than her sister, buried her face in his chest, offering no words, only the shallow shivers of exhaustion and fear. When sleep finally overtook them, Silas carried both girls upstairs, one on each arm, Ranger padding behind. He laid them carefully in their beds, covering them with the same blanket they had once shared when their mother was alive. But as he adjusted the blanket, his eyes caught the faint discolorations on their wrists, greenish bruises fading into yellow at the edges. With a soldier's precision, he checked further on Clara's thin shoulder, on Lily's calves. Old marks, not new, the kind that spoke of repetition, not accident. He felt his jaw clench, his fists tightening until his knuckles whitened. Ranger gave a low whine, sensing the storm in his master's chest, and pressed his head gently against Silas's knee. He stayed by their bedside the entire night. Ranger curled at the doorway like a sentry, ears twitching at every sound, refusing to close his eyes. Silas, seated in the wooden chair that creaked beneath his weight, did not sleep. Instead, he kept vigil, watching the faint rise and fall of his daughter's chest, noting how even in slumber, Clara's hands twitched as though recoiling from unseen blows. Morning light seeped through the blinds in slivers of gray. The air smelled of rain-soaked soil outside, but inside it smelled only of lavender polish and stage perfection. Silas brewed a pot of coffee with mechanical hands, the bitter taste grounding him back to routine. Veronica descended the stairs dressed in a pressed blouse and fitted slacks, her dark hair brushed sleek, her face painted into composure. She looked more like a hostess for a suburban luncheon than a stepmother who had been caught looming over children in the night. "You'll ruin them if you coddle them," she said casually as she poured herself juice. "Kids need discipline." Her tone was airy, dismissive, as if the night's events were nothing but childish drama. Silas didn't respond, his eyes hardening as he drained his cup, then turned his attention to the day ahead. He drove Clara and Lily to school in his old pickup, the worn seats familiar under his hands. The girls sat pressed together in the back, clutching their shared stuffed bear, their eyes downcast. Ranger rode in the passenger seat, his head occasionally turning to glance back at them, a quiet reassurance that he too would not leave their side. The school sat on the edge of Mapleford, a squat red brick building with moss climbing its walls and a playground damp from last night's rain. Silas walked the girls inside, his large frame drawing glances from other parents. Miss Harper, their teacher, greeted them at the door. Evelyn Harper was in her late 30s, with sandy hair tied in a loose bun and round glasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. She wore a cardigan speckled with chalk dust and had the kind of gentle, weary smile of someone who carried the burdens of many children, not just her own. Born and raised in a small Ohio town before moving to Mapleford, she had taught for over a decade, known among parents for her patience, though it often masked a streak of helpless frustration at the system's limits. "Good morning, Clara." "Lily," she said softly, crouching to their level. Clara avoided her eyes. Lily merely gave the faintest nod. Evelyn's smile faltered before she straightened and addressed Silas. "They've been quieter than usual these past months. They draw often, but—" She hesitated, her voice lowering. "Mostly houses, dark houses, no lights in the windows, sometimes just corners shaded in black." The words tightened something already coiled inside Silas. "And you notice bruises?" he asked, his voice flat, controlled. Evelyn shifted uneasily, adjusting her glasses. "Once or twice. Veronica always said they were clumsy, that accidents happen. I couldn't press further without risking my position." "You know how it is," Silas's gaze locked on hers, unblinking. "You'll tell me if you see anything again." "Anything at all." He pulled a card from his wallet, scribbled his number on the back, and pressed it into her palm with the firmness of an order. Evelyn nodded, her expression troubled. She had seen that kind of look before. The look of a soldier still standing on a battlefield, even if no shots were fired. On the drive home, silence hung heavy in the cab. Ranger leaned his head against Silas's arm, as though sensing the weight pressing down on his master. The city blurred past the diners with neon signs, the mechanic's shop with rusted cars lined up, the rows of identical houses with perfectly trimmed lawns. To outsiders, Mapleford City looked like a portrait of peace. But to Silas, the streets were as foreign and hostile as any deployment zone, hiding threats behind picket fences. That night, after dinner passed in strained quiet, Silas tucked the girls in once more. He noticed how Lily hesitated before lying down, glancing at the shadow beneath her bed, as if expecting the so-called monster Derek spoke of to lunge out. Silas knelt beside her, his hand warm on her back. "Nothing gets past Ranger," he whispered. Ranger lay stretched across the floorboards, his golden-brown coat gleaming in the lamplight, his tail thumping once in acknowledgement. His loyalty was not the exuberant playfulness of a puppy, but the solemn devotion of a guardian who had seen danger and was prepared to face it again. Later, as the house darkened, Silas remained in the chair outside their room. Through the crack in the door, he watched their chests rise and fall. He thought of the bruises, the whispers, the empty walls stripped of their childhood drawings. And beneath it all, he thought of his late wife, the woman whose laughter once filled these same rooms. She had been the steady center of his world before a car accident ripped her away. He had married Veronica in a fog of grief, convinced the girls needed a maternal figure, blind to the poison he had invited into their home. Now staring into the dark hallway, he knew the war wasn't behind him. It had simply changed uniforms, and this time, the battlefield was his own house. The following evening, Silas sat alone in the twins' bedroom after tucking them into bed. The rain had ceased outside, but the house felt no less stormy. Clara clutched her old stuffed bear, a once soft creature whose fur was now matted from years of handling. Its seams were splitting, stuffing poking out along the belly. Silas had noticed the toy before, but hadn't thought much of it until Clara, half asleep, whispered, "Don't tell," and squeezed the bear tighter, as though it held more than cotton inside. When she drifted into slumber, her breath shallow and uneven, Silas lifted the bear gently from her arms. Ranger padded closer, sniffing curiously, tail flicking once. Silas examined the ragged seam and, with careful fingers, pried it open. His heart sank when he pulled out a folded scrap of paper, torn from a notebook. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, pressed deep into the page as if carved by a trembling hand. "Don't tell." Nothing more, yet the message carried the weight of a prison sentence. Silas refolded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He glanced at his daughters, both curled tightly as though bracing against unseen blows. Ranger shifted, ears twitching toward the hallway. A faint creak echoed from below footsteps, slow and deliberate. Silas extinguished the bedside lamp, sinking into the chair by the wall, waiting. Moments later, a muffled voice slithered through the crack of the door. Derek Hale, 16 years old, tall and wiry, with acne marking his pale cheeks and a permanent sneer etched onto his lips. He was Veronica's son from a previous relationship, a boy who had grown up under the shadow of a mother who treated cruelty like currency. At school, Derek played the clown, loud and mocking, but his eyes gave him away, hard, restless eyes that carried the bitterness of neglect and the arrogance of someone who learned that power could be taken by force. "Monsters waiting under your bed," Derek whispered in a sing-song tone, his words soaked with malice. "One day, if you tell Daddy, it'll drag you down and chew your legs off." Silas clenched his fists in the dark. He had learned long ago in deserts overseas how to stay silent even when rage burned like fire in his chest. Ranger, however, was not so patient. A guttural growl erupted from his throat, deep and primal. He launched himself at the door, claws scratching against wood, barking with a ferocity that made Derek stumble back. "What the?" Derek hissed, his bravado cracking as Ranger's snarl filled the hall. "Crazy mutt!" His footsteps retreated quickly, the sound of sneakers pounding down the stairs. The twins stirred but did not wake. Silas placed a calming hand on Ranger's head, whispering, "Not yet, boy. Not yet." The next day, Silas sought counsel beyond the walls of his home. He visited the modest house of Mrs. Collins, the elderly neighbor who lived just across the narrow back alley. She was in her late 70s, a widow with white hair always pinned neatly into a bun, her porch decorated with wind chimes that tinkled like fragile secrets. She had lived in Mapleford all her life and carried the air of someone who had seen too much yet said too little. When Silas knocked, she peered out through lace curtains before opening the door, her lined face wary. "James Miller," she began, using his full name with the familiarity of a longtime neighbor. "I wondered when you'd come." "It's Silas," he corrected gently. "I need to ask you something." "About my girls." Mrs. Collins' hands trembled as she poured tea, the porcelain rattling against the saucers. "I've heard things," she admitted, her voice hushed. "Crying at night. Little whimpers that carried through the walls, sometimes a scream. But what could I do? Veronica, she's not the sort you cross. Her mother is well connected, and well, I'm just an old woman with no fight left in me." Silas's jaw tightened, though his tone remained respectful. Even silence can wound. But I need your honesty now. If this goes further, will you testify? Mrs. Collins hesitated, her gaze flickering to the crucifix hanging above her mantel. After a long pause, she nodded slowly. I can't swear to everything, but I won't stay silent anymore. Not if it saves those girls. Silas left with a grim nod, the folded scrap of paper in his pocket weighing heavier than steel. He knew the truth alone would not be enough. He needed evidence, irrefutable and undeniable. That evening, he made a call to a man he hadn't spoken to in months. Marcus Doyle, an old comrade from his army days. Marcus had been a communications officer, skilled in surveillance, now working in private security after retiring from the service. Marcus arrived 2 nights later, driving a dented Jeep that smelled faintly of tobacco. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with dark skin weathered by the sun and eyes that scanned every detail like a hawk. He had grown up in Detroit, the son of a factory worker, hardened early by city violence before the army had given him discipline and direction. Marcus was pragmatic, blunt, and loyal, the kind of man who wouldn't ask questions unless the answer mattered. You sound worse than you ever did overseas, Marcus said as he stepped into Silas's kitchen, setting a duffel bag on the table. What's going on? Silas handed him the note. Marcus read it once, his lips pressing into a grim line. Kids don't write this unless they're terrified. He opened the duffel, revealing equipment, tiny recording devices, a pen camera, a modified phone charger with a hidden mic. You're going to need proof. Cold, solid proof. Silas's eyes flicked to the staircase, where Ranger sat like a sentinel, ears pricked. I'll get it. Whatever it takes that night, Silas began. He planted a recording device in the hallway outside the twins' bedroom, hidden behind a loose panel of wood. Another was slipped inside the tattered bear, stitched carefully so Clara would never notice the difference. Ranger watched silently, tail brushing the floor, as if recognizing the gravity of the act. When the house settled into its uneasy slumber, Silas sat awake, ears tuned to every creak. Veronica's heels clicked faintly across the kitchen tile below. Derek's laughter rose and fell from the living room, sharp and mocking. Through the headphones connected to his device, Silas heard words that made his blood run cold. Veronica chastising the girls for imagined slights. Derek taunting them with stories of monsters that would come if they dared complain. The recordings crackled softly, but the fear in her daughter's voices was crystal clear. Every whimper, every stifled sob etched itself into Silas's heart like scars. Ranger shifted closer, laying his heavy head on Silas's lap, as though sharing the burden. Silas stared into the darkness, his resolve sharpening. War had taught him patience, but fatherhood demanded action. And now, with evidence building and allies beside him, the path forward was set. The battle was no longer just for survival. It was for justice. The house no longer felt like a home, but like a stage where cruelty rehearsed itself night after night. Silas moved silently through the rooms, his every step deliberate, the soldier in him resurfacing in measured breaths and calculated movements. Veronica thought him passive, still weary from years of service, but she underestimated the discipline forged in war. He was patient, but he was never blind. A week after Marcus delivered the equipment, Silas brought home a new teddy bear for Clara and Lily. It was slightly larger than the old one, its fur soft and golden, eyes made of dark glass that glinted under the lamplight. Clara hugged it instantly, the corners of her lips twitching toward a rare smile. She had no idea the bear carried within its stitched belly a pinhole camera and an audio chip, designed to record every whisper that passed through the room. Ranger sniffed at the toy, his nose twitching, then settled, satisfied as if he too understood its secret mission. The first recordings came 2 nights later. Silas sat in the truck outside the house, headphones snug over his ears, while Marcus monitored the feed remotely from his office across town. The children's voices were faint, Clara humming to herself, Lily whispering about a storybook. Then Veronica's heels clicked across the floor. Her voice cut through the static, sharp and shrill. Useless little things. Can't even clean up after yourselves. You think anyone would love you if it weren't for me? Silas's grip on the steering wheel tightened until the leather creaked. Ranger, lying in the passenger seat, let out a low growl, sensing the tension that rippled through his master. Then Derek's voice intruded, mocking and cruel. "Remember the monster? It gets closer every time you talk to Dad. It knows when you lie." There was a muffled sob, Clara's voice, begging for silence, followed by Lily's broken whimper. Then the sound of something thrown against the wall, and Veronica's cold laugh echoing like glass shattering. Marcus's voice came through the phone, steady but grave. "You've got your proof. More than enough to put the system on notice." But for Silas, proof wasn't just legal, it was personal. Each recording was a blade twisting deeper. Each bruise uncovered another scar on his conscience. Days bled into nights, each one documented. Silas became a shadow in his own house, careful never to tip his hand. Veronica carried on as if she were the perfect stepmother when neighbors stopped by, her smile polished, her hands busy with casseroles and polished dishes. Derek laughed loudly in the backyard with his friends, swaggering like a king in his small kingdom. Yet behind closed doors, the recordings told another story, a story of venom, of children silenced by fear. In those nights, Ranger became more than a guard dog. The German Shepherd, 6 years old and built with the sturdy frame of a seasoned working dog, had been trained to track and protect during Silas's deployments. His fur was a blend of sable and tan, his muzzle gray-flecked from age, his amber eyes holding the patience of a creature that had seen both battlefields and playgrounds. He would crawl under the twins' bed, lying there until their trembling slowed, his presence a wall of warmth against their nightmares. Sometimes Silas would peek in and see their small hands draped over the side of the bed, fingertips brushing against Ranger's coat as if to anchor themselves to the one being they trusted without hesitation. Silas knew the evidence needed to leave the confines of his house. He arranged a meeting with Marcus in the back room of a mechanic's shop where the din of tools drowned out private words. Marcus reviewed the files with a grim expression, nodding occasionally but never smiling. "This is enough to wake up Child Protective Services," Marcus said, slipping the drives into a padded case. "But you need to prepare yourself. Cases like this get ugly. Veronica's mother has connections. She'll fight, claim you're bitter, that you're manufacturing all this." Silas's reply was simple. "Let her. The truth will stand." 2 nights later, a particular recording drove away all remnants of doubt. Silas sat alone in the kitchen, coffee cooling in his mug, when the latest file downloaded. At first, the audio was muffled, the girls whispering, Clara asking if Dad would leave again, Lily saying she didn't want to sleep. Then Veronica's voice exploded, shrill and venomous. "Stop that crying! You're nothing but burdens. You think soldiers come home for brats like you? He'll leave again, and when he does, you'll have no one." A slap cracked the air, followed by Clara's sharp gasp. Then silence, except for Lily's sobbing muffled against her sister's shoulder. Silas removed the headphones slowly, his hands trembling. Ranger nudged his arm with his nose, as though reminding him to breathe. In that moment, Silas knew the war inside his home had crossed the threshold. It was no longer about suspicion. It was no longer about waiting. The time had come to act. He rose from the table and walked upstairs. The house was quiet, Veronica already asleep in the master bedroom, Derek's snores echoing faintly through the hall. Silas stepped into the twins' room, where the glow of the nightlight painted the walls a soft amber. Clara and Lily slept curled together, the new teddy bear clasped between them. Ranger lifted his head from beneath the bed, his eyes glinting, tail thumping softly against the floor. Silas lowered himself to one knee beside them. He brushed a stray curl from Clara's forehead and whispered, "It's over soon. I promise." His voice was steady, but his heart roared like thunder in his chest. The next morning, he met Marcus in the courthouse parking lot. They transferred the evidence to a sealed envelope addressed to Child Protective Services. The sun was climbing over Mapleford's skyline, casting the streets in a light that felt almost new, as if the city itself were waking to truths long buried in silence. The courthouse of Riverbend County stood tall and square, its stone facade weathered by decades of storms, its clock tower casting a long shadow across the morning pavement. For most people, it was just another government building, But for Silas Miller, it felt like the last battlefield he would ever enter. He walked up the wide steps flanked by marble columns, his two daughters holding tightly to his hands. Ranger padded close beside them, tail swishing low, his dark eyes scanning the crowd as if he understood the gravity of the day. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with murmurs and the squeak of shoes against polished floors. Silas spotted his attorney, Jonathan Brooks, waiting by the benches. Brooks was in his early 50s, a man with silver streaks through his once black hair, spectacles perched firmly on his nose. He carried the air of someone who had been through countless legal storms but never lost his compass. Born to a family of teachers in Illinois, Brooks had chosen law out of a hunger for justice after watching his younger sister suffer in a foster system that had failed her. That wound had never healed, and it showed in the meticulous way he prepared every case, his voice calm but unyielding when speaking for the voiceless. "Morning, Silas," Brooks greeted, clasping his client's hand firmly. "I've gone through every file, every recording. This is airtight, but be prepared. Veronica will fight to the very end." Silas gave a curt nod. "Let her try." The trial stretched across days. Veronica, dressed in carefully chosen dresses that painted her as the wronged woman, sat beside her own lawyer, eyes cold, lips pressed into a practiced pout. Derek slouched behind her, his face pale, fidgeting with his sleeve, while Martha Hale, Veronica's mother, sat ramrod straight, her gray hair perfectly styled, her presence radiating an air of social influence. Martha had once been a respected community organizer, praised for her charity work, but behind closed doors she had raised her daughter with iron fists and icy silence, teaching her that cruelty was strength. The prosecutor played the recordings in open court. Veronica's voice filled the room, sharp, venomous, dripping with contempt for the two girls who now clung to their father's side. Derek's taunts followed, mocking about monsters under the bed. And then came the sobbing, the pleading, the slap. Gasps rippled through the audience. Veronica's face stiffened, her facade cracking for a brief second before she leaned to whisper furiously to her attorney. Jonathan Brooks rose, his voice steady but sharp as a blade. He guided the court through the timeline, the bruises, the neighbor's testimony, the school teacher's observations. Mrs. Collins testified, her wrinkled hands trembling as she described the cries she had heard through her walls, her voice breaking but resolute. Miss Harper took the stand as well, describing the twins' withdrawn drawings of dark houses, her own helpless frustration plain in her tone. Every word added another stone to the wall of evidence. When it was Derek's turn, the boy shifted uneasily. 16 years old, still technically a child, yet old enough to understand consequences. He avoided his mother's gaze, mumbling half-hearted denials. Ranger, sitting quietly by Silas's feet in the gallery, let out a single growl that echoed faintly, and Derek faltered, his voice breaking as he admitted to repeating his mother's threats. At last, the judge delivered the verdict. His robe rustled as he leaned forward, his voice echoing through the chamber. Veronica Hale, for the substantiated abuse and endangerment of minors. This court sentences you to 5 years in state prison. Derek Hale, given your age and testimony, you will be placed under the guardianship of your grandmother, Martha Hale, with ongoing supervision by Child Services. Martha Hale, though your direct actions were limited, your neglect enabled this abuse. You will be placed under probationary oversight. The gavel struck once, sharp as a gunshot. Clara squeezed her sister's hand, her eyes wide with both fear and relief. Silas felt the tension in his shoulders loosen, though not vanish. Justice had been served, but scars remained. Later that afternoon, in a small office adjacent to the courthouse, Silas signed the final papers for divorce. The ink on the page severed the last chain binding him to Veronica. The lawyer slid the documents across the desk, and Silas pressed his thumb to the embossed seal. He felt no triumph, only release. The weeks that followed brought new decisions. Silas had spent 2 decades in uniform, a life defined by orders, deployments, and distant horizons. But as he watched his daughters settle into a fragile rhythm of laughter and trust, he knew the war that mattered was here. He submitted his resignation to the Army, requesting honorable discharge. His commanding officer, though reluctant, understood. "You fought enough battles for this country," the officer said. "Now fight for your family." Soon after, Silas began work at the Mapleford Department of Social Protection, a modest office housed in a converted brick building near the town square. His role was part investigator, part advocate ensuring children's safety, supporting struggling families, and intervening where silence had once reigned. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. And in each case, he carried the memory of his daughters, a reminder of what neglect and cruelty could do. At home, the air gradually changed. Clara and Lily began to draw pictures, not of dark corners, but of gardens, trees, and small houses with glowing windows. Ranger remained their silent sentinel, lying by their beds each night, padding beside them on their walks to school, his presence a comfort greater than words. Neighbors began to notice two little girls skipping in the yard, their father smiling faintly as he fixed the porch rail, the dog's bark carrying not menace but life. One evening, Clara and Lily taped a new drawing to the refrigerator. It showed a house with lights shining through the windows, a father standing in the doorway, two little girls playing beneath a tree, and a large German shepherd lying protectively at their feet. Beneath the picture, in shaky letters, the word home. Silas stood staring at it for a long time, his throat tightening. Ranger nudged his hand gently, tail swishing. For the first time in years, the house did not feel like enemy ground. It felt like the very thing the girls had drawn, a place worth defending, not with weapons, but with love and vigilance. Sometimes the deepest battles are not fought on distant fields, but within the walls of our own homes. Silas learned that protecting his daughters was not about strength alone, but about the courage to stay, to listen, and to act when silence could have been easier. Ranger's loyalty became a reminder that love does not always need words, only presence. And in the end, two little girls found the meaning of home not in bricks or furniture, but in the steady arms of a father who refused to walk away. What about you? Do you believe that even the most broken homes can be rebuilt with trust and love? Share your thoughts in the comments. I always read them, and I am always listening. If this story moved you, please like the video, follow for more, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Together, let us keep telling the tales that remind us what family, faith, and loyalty truly mean.